Hey folks, today if you follow any kind of history or heritage account, your timeline is probably flooded with tributes to George Washington on his birthday. Everyone trying to get their edge in. Mount Vernon, Mount Vernon's library, the Museum of the American Revolution, Colonial Williamsburg, the Longfellow House at Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, George Washington's birthplace, National Monument, of course. And we can just so go on and on and on. But of course, none of them mentions the people who made Washington possible. I'm not talking about his parents. Not a single part of Washington's world was built by his hands. It was built by the hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children who lived and died in bondage, serving death sentences at labor, so that he could become the celebrated white man that history remembers badly. We do not know their birthdays. Neither George nor Martha recorded them, but they did record in detail their orders to buy more people, just as like their orders to buy more linen and more furniture, their orders to separate families, their orders to hunt down those who dared to seek freedom, just as they're ordering more Madeira. Washington wasn't just an enslaver. He was a promoter of slavery, running his estate as a forced labor camp, an industrial machine with calculated efficiency in which black lives were just a coefficient. He divided enslaved families across properties to keep them dependent. He manipulated marriage arrangements between the people he claimed to own and those who belonged to Martha to discourage their escape. And he created systems that made his workforce easier to control, more manageable. And when the people he enslaved resisted, he used every tool at his disposal to break them. Yet they built and paid for Mount Vernon and everything in it, everything around it, responsible for harvesting and processing everything that came from it. Washington became Washington only because of them. We don't celebrate their birthdays. We barely know their names, except for a few dozen, just first names, further distinguished by which farm, which forced labor camp they were sentenced to serve their time on. Adam from Dogue Run. Alice from Mansion Farm. We know Oney Judge. She was just a teenager when she took her freedom into her own hands, knowing Washington would never willingly give it to her, rather than face a future with Martha's niece, who had a reputation for even more brutality than the Washingtons had. Oney spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder as Washington deployed agents to drag her back to Mount Vernon, literally. We know Hercules Posey, who was Mount Vernon's celebrated chef, praised for his talent but treated as property. And when he vanished into the Philadelphia night, Washington was furious, not because he cared about losing a person, because he lost an asset. He even mentioned about Oney that he might have given her freedom had she asked politely, but her impertinence made it impossible for him to even consider it. He was due his respect. And we know Harry Washington and the 18 other enslaved men and women who declared their own independence at the beginning of the Revolutionary War because they went to find actual freedom with the British. And we also know Frank Lee, who spent his life overseeing the daily operations of Mount Vernon, who spent his life, in fact, making the interior of that mansion house possible. He knew the estate better than Washington himself did, but by the end of his freedom was not his own to claim. And we know his brother Billy, who was by Washington's side for most of the Revolutionary War, and at least mentioned by the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site by the National Park Service. Of all of the accounts and all the posts that I have seen today, it is the only mention of any enslaved person in relation to George Washington. And Billy was the only person whom Washington gave freedom to. Don't believe the people who say that Washington freed his enslaved people. He didn't. He freed Billy Lee and made sure that all the people that he owned would be freed on Martha's death. She could have lived 2 years. She could have lived 20. She's the one who freed them earlier, mainly because she was terrified of them and had good reason. But all of those people, there are hundreds whose names we will never, ever know, much less their birthdays. Washington tracked them as numbers in his farm reports, his account books, his ledgers. A name might pop up in correspondence, usually in relation to discipline. Their lives were measured in productivity, in profit, in pounds of tobacco and barrels of flour, in cherry bottles. So today, while others celebrate Washington's birth, remember the people whose lives, labor, and legacies he stole, who don't get birthday celebrations. They don't even get acknowledged. Because without them, there is no George Washington, there is no Mount Vernon, and there is no United States.